Hello, everybody! I often sit here and think, one of these days, I'm going to iron my t-shirt before I start. And then I never do. It's because I'm very lazy and I don't own an iron. God, I look like a right scruff bag. Anyway, sorry. Really lovely to be back. I'm going to carry on reading The Devil's Engine, Hellraisers. We are now in Prague. Pan and Marlowe, Pan has brought Marlowe, and the rest of the Hellraisers have brought Marlowe to Prague, where they're going to show him the Devil's Engine, which is the machine that grants them all their superpowers. And this is what happens. I don't know how many I'll get done today, but I'll do my best to get through a good chunk. We're on page 185, if anyone is reading along at home. The Book of Dead Engineers. Sorry, I needed to burp. Okay. Pan walked into the courtyard of the nest, feeling like it had been a million years since she'd last been here, not a month. Brick walls that had seen better days surrounded it on three sides. The fourth was made up of a building, one that had once been a church. It, too, was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, tiles missing from the roof, a short, squat tower, bent at an angle. Only the door, big and red, perfectly lacquered, appeared new. Pan didn't look at it though. That door was an evil piece of work. The courtyard was full of people. Herc was in one corner, arguing with Hansen. Truck and Knight leaned against each other, both looking exhausted. Being under contract did that to you, sapped everything except whatever it was you traded for. Bullwinkle and Hope sat on a crate, Bully picking his nose so enthusiastically it was like he'd found treasure in there. She started to look for Forrest, then caught herself. He's not here, is he? Because he's in hell. The light in the yard came from a couple of halogen lamps, and she hated it. It was yellow and sickly, and it turned everyone it touched into walking corpses. Every time she was here, she had the impression that she was in a graveyard where the dead had decided to start living again. Who are all these people? Marlowe asked. The kid was the colour of wet ash, his body stooped and weak, his eyes red-rimmed and raw. Every time he breathed, he made a sound like a broken accordion. She still didn't know what Herc saw in him, other than the asthma. It was always easier to turn someone when there was something they wanted, or rather, something they didn't want. They're roadies, Pan said, nodding at the guys unloading the cars. They do the donkey work. You can trust them. Marlowe nodded. He was still in shock, she guessed. She couldn't blame him. She'd not been right for weeks after she'd first seen the engine. She watched him as he studied the courtyard, the walls, then the door, and she saw the exact moment it hit him. That feeling. He staggered a couple of paces, groaning, thumping into Truck, holding on to the big guy like he was a life raft in the middle of a cold, dark ocean. Somebody's getting his first taste, Truck said. Just ride it out, bro. It gets better, eventually. What is that? Marlowe said, putting his hands to his ears. Pan knew what he would be hearing, the voices, the sounds, those infernal scratchings. Barks that didn't come from any dog, screams that couldn't be human, a dozen whispered voices tickling the inside of his skull like cold, wet tongues. She could hear them too, although she'd been here enough times now to know how to tune them out. There were smells as well, rotting flesh, excrement and sulphur, always sulphur. It didn't matter how clean they kept the yard, how many times they scrubbed the door, those smells never went away. Ignore it, she said, as he reached into his pocket again, taking a blast of his inhaler. It's just messing with you. The engine? He asked, wincing. Yeah. He looked like he was going to ask her another question, but she didn't have the patience for it. She pushed past him and walked up to Herc. Waiting for anything special, she said, or do you just enjoy standing around like ducks in the rain? Herc's eyeballs bulged with rage, but he gritted his teeth, swallowing noisily. You think we're going to let your new boyfriend in without a test, Hansen said, leering at her behind those sunglasses. She was grateful that he was wearing them, because she knew what he looked like underneath. So test him then, Pan said. I'm freezing my ass off here. And you're boring mine, Hansen said, walking away. She wrapped her hands around herself, stomping on the wet ground and cursing him under her breath. She knew there was no way around it. Given that the Circulus Inferni would try anything to find out the location of their engine, it made sense to ensure that they weren't letting a spy through the door. Marlowe looked like a dope, but appearances could be deceptive. She glanced at him, stooped over in his wet clothes, his brow furrowed, and his bottom lip quivering. Yeah, not that deceptive. Hanson placed a hand on either side of Marlowe's head and lifted it until he was staring right into his eyes. The boy struggled a little, but only the way a beaten dog struggles when it knows it can't escape. "What's your name?" Hanson asked. "Marlowe Green," he shivered. Hanson always dealt for mind reading, amongst other things, so he'd know if the kid was lying. "Are you working for Mammon, for the Circulus Inferni?" "No," he said. "No way, man. Do you have any plans to infiltrate the engine? To destroy or otherwise damage the engine? To cause harm to anyone working for this organisation?" I'm feeling like I might want to kick you in the balls sometime soon. Does that count?" Marlowe said, and a spluttered laugh actually escaped Pan's lips before she managed to catch it. Hanson gripped Marlowe's head harder, making the boy wince. "Do you have any plans to infiltrate the engine, to destroy or otherwise damage the engine, to cause harm to anyone working for this organisation?" "No," he said. "Of course not." Hanson tilted his head back, his nostrils flaring like he was sniffing for a lie. He let go, pushing Marlowe away and wiping his hands on his trousers. "He's clean," he said. "Holding a pretty big torch for you, though, Pam. Just about all I could see in that simple little excuse for a mind." "No, wait, what? No, Marlowe spluttered, and Pan turned away before he could see her cheeks boil. "Close up," Herc yelled to two of the roadies near the gates. They obeyed, slamming them closed and pulling a bar down to lock them. It wasn't exactly secure, but Pan knew they could leave the gates wide open and intruders still wouldn't be able to find their way through the big, red, evil door. Excuse me. This place was protected by something else, something older and vastly more powerful. "I honestly don't know what he's talking about," Marlowe said. Herc put his hand to his collar mic and yelled, "Crack it!" Pan steeled herself, taking 3 deep breaths, blowing each one out slowly. This part of the process always sucked. The door uttered a series of clicks, soft and wet and chittering, like there was a giant cockroach on the other side. Then it hit her, a sudden, thunderous chaos of light and noise, right in the centre of her brain. She groaned, clenching her fists as hard as she could, trying not to see but unable to switch it off. Corpses, toothless mouths twisted open in horror, maggots spilling out of empty eye sockets, limbs flailing inside an inferno, and something else, something worse than the demons, worse even than Mammon. A sculpture of bone and shadow that sat above it all, watching her with a cluster of fat, black spider eyes. The door clunked again, swinging open, and the images vanished like a projector in her brain had been turned off. She swayed unsteadily, shaking her head like she could somehow dislodge what had been in there. She hawked up a wad of acid and spat, feeling the blood trickle down from her nose into her mouth. Every frickin' time. She glared at the door, wondering if, when all this was over, she'd be allowed to take an axe to it, carve it into splinters. Not that she'd dare. She marched towards it, her stomach churning. Behind her came Truck, holding Marlowe like a sack of groceries. The kid looked close to passing out, his breathing shallow and ragged. It was always worse the first time, feeling the engine inside your head. She'd thrown up over Herc and Hanson. One recruit had died on the spot. "Age before beauty," Herc said, flashing his monstrous, gap-toothed grin. Pan walked to the door, seeing the inside of the church, the rotting pews, the holes in the roof where the rain dripped through, the vines that had taken root and were climbing the pillars. She took a deep breath, then crossed the threshold, feeling that familiar twist and tumble deep inside, her guts protesting as she passed over. Everything fizzed, bolts of bright white agony flashing across the front of her brain. She took another step, forcing herself to, knowing that if she paused here she'd be stuck here forever, in the space between. The pain fluttered away like a startled bird, and she was standing in a narrow corridor, shivering against the sudden chill. She walked a few steps, then looked back, seeing the same open red door, and beyond it a view that never failed to take her breath away. A field of snow, as crisp and unbroken as a blank page, ridgeback mountains faintly visible through the blizzard. A face appeared from nowhere, a yellowing skull almost invisible against the vista beyond. It pushed into the space, changing, growing a sheen of red, strands of muscle, a layer of skin and hair. Then Truck was in the corridor, Marlowe materialising alongside him. The kid stood for a moment, then opened his mouth and retched, a dribble of sick hanging from his chin. This way, said Pan, leading them down the corridor, trying to ignore the unpleasant tickling in her skull, the half-whispers that danced against her eardrums. Insignias decorated the walls, recognisable even though somebody had tried to scratch them away. A swastika, an outstretched eagle. They made her stomach churn just as much as the vibes that blasted up from below. After 30 yards or so, the passageway ended at an elevator. The doors stood open, the mouth of a predator waiting for her to walk right in. And she did. Truck and Marlowe followed, making the elevator wobble, and she tried not to think about how deep the shaft stretched beneath them, the thousands of feet of empty space between her and the pit below. Here we go again, Herc said as he strolled inside. The elevator rumbled, then started to clatter down. The first time she'd used it, Pan had felt like she was on some kind of reverse rocket, one that was blasting down into the earth rather than up into space. Even now, after so many trips, her stomach did loop-the-loops as they picked up speed. She ignored the need to hold on to something, her hands balled into fists, closing her eyes for the 48 seconds it took the elevator to slow. She heard the noise of the bullpen before they'd come to a halt, a clamour of voices and machinery that tripled in volume when Herc wrenched open the gates. He ushered them out into the first level of the complex, a room easily as big as a couple of basketball courts. It had been carved out of the rock, the grey walls and ceiling rough-hewn and uneven, all except for a section above the elevator which displayed a huge swastika. It had been covered up with a dozen tarps, but it still seemed to burn up there, scorching a hole right into the past. Under it, somebody, an engineer from the 80s apparently, had painted the words "Nazis suck, Hellraisers rule." Everything else in the space was brand new. Banks of hard drives lined the far wall, humming. There were more than 100 of them, each the size of a fridge, cased in 3 layers of transparent plastic so the damp and the cold wouldn't get to them. The lights blinked warily, making her think of caged animals at the zoo. Next to them was a whole wall of monitors, the 2 outer ones as big as cinema screens, the other 16 mounted in between. Each one showed the usual display of numbers and countdowns and infograms, like a NASA control centre. One of the big ones, though, was playing a Harry Potter movie. 4 women and 3 men sat on swivel chairs in front of it, rapt, scoffing popcorn from a couple of saucepans. Herc strolled halfway across the room, almost on his tiptoes, waiting until he was close enough before clapping his hands together. The noise was like a rifle shot, echoing off the walls, and the lawyers just about fell out of their chairs. "Jesus Christ!" yelled Seth in his heavy Austrian accent, which I'm probably not going to try and do either. Nobody really knew how old Seth was. Sometimes he looked 60, sometimes 80. Right now he looked about 100 as he clapped a liver-spotted hand to his chest. You would really do this to me, an old man who's had 4 heart attacks already in life. You are a bad guy, Herman Cole. You will be the death of me." Apparently I am doing the accent. "Oh, I could never be so lucky," Herc said, walking the rest of the way and embracing the man fondly. They looked like a couple of old crusties meeting at the park, Pan thought, smiling. "Good to see your mind's on the job," said Truck. "Nice to know you're working hard on cracking our contracts." Seth waved a hand like he was wafting away a bad smell. "Oh, please, you know I could crack yours as easily as I could crack a fart. You insult me, Gregory, with your pathetic deals. When will you be brave enough and go for something really fun?" One of the other lawyers had paused the film, and they were all milling around now like they were actually working. Pan ignored them. She knew a little about each of them, but other than Seth, she did her best to avoid them. There was something about knowing the person who had to break your contract that made the whole thing scarier, made it more real. It was better to pretend that some nameless, faceless superhero was trying to save your life, not an old guy with a triple bypass or some geeky mathematicians from MIT who was still young enough to think that ironic t-shirts were cool. "It is good to see you, Amelia," Seth said, using the name that Pan hated. "We almost lost you then. That was a tough cookie to break. See, Gregory, you should be more like this young lady here, actually giving me some work to do." Seth wiggled his huge, bushy eyebrows at her and smiled, and she couldn't help but smile back. Until she thought of Forrest, that was. "You should have broken his contract," she said. "We didn't have to lose another one." "Cody," Seth sighed. "Yes, we should have. I'm sorry, Amelia. Ostein commanded us to keep your contracts active until your mission was complete, and by that time it was too late. We only just managed to break yours in time." "Yeah, I noticed," she said, scratching her chest, her ruined heart. Seth walked to her, placed a warm, leathery hand on her shoulder. "I am truly sorry, my girl. It was not my choice. But it is my responsibility. I should have said no to Ostheim. Yeah, right. Nobody said no to Ostheim. Pan shrugged him away. I will write his name in the book, Seth said. Don't, she replied. She steeled herself, walking to the corner of the room. There was a desk there, an old leather-bound ledger, the only thing on it. It was open now, and she ran her hand down the list of names written there in black ink. Lucy White, Simmer. Becky Smith, Bluebeard. Sophie Hicks, T-Rex. Wesley Adams, Marathon Man. Tyra Ginn, Spitfire. Ryan Hodap, Hammer. Hannah Wilkinson, Berserker. Letitia Gallardo, Bookworm. Courtney Webb, Captain Obvious. All the engineers and their war names. All of them dead. Some of them rotting in the ground. Most of them somewhere far, far worse. She did what she always did, flicking back through the book. How many names? 1,000? Those at the front were faded almost beyond recognition, centuries old. And how many more would there be before it all ended? Picking up the pen, she wrote Cody, then stopped, racking her brains. What the hell had his surname been? The pen hovered and she felt the shame wrap her up, smothering her. How could she forget it? He was dead, and she couldn't even remember his name. It's better this way, better to forget he ever existed, better to... Baranowski. It suddenly vomited back into her head, and she scribbled it down, adding Forrest in brackets afterward. Herc had given them that name because he'd always been going on about how life was like a box of chocolates. She ran her finger softly over the name, then closed the book with deliberate slowness. Job done. Time to move on. I will not think of him again. And who is this? Said Seth, getting out of his chair and shuffling over to Marlowe. A new recruit. Oh, goody. Seth, meet Marlowe, said Pan. Seth took Marlowe's head in both of his, studied him like a scientist might study a rat. He nodded approvingly. Oh, Marlowe, how fitting, he said. Not sure if that's still an Austrian accent, but putting his head to Marlowe's chest. A bit of asthma there, I see. Nothing we can't take care of. A good specimen, Herman. We will have a lot of fun with this one. Have you thought about what you might like, Marlowe? Have they filled you in on the possibilities? The endless, wonderful possibilities? Said Marlowe. He can wait, said Herc. It's been a long day, a long few days. We should rest. Balderdash, said Seth. You need no such thing. Please, let's work up a contract for him. You don't know how bored I get here. They make me do terrible things when you are gone. These films they make me watch about wizards and dragons and strange elves with socks. I cannot think with such nonsense in my head. He put it on, said one of the lawyers, a young woman called Trix. He's made us watch it 4 times this week already. Lies, said Seth, holding up his hands. See how they slander me. Come, come. He took Marlowe's elbow and walked with him towards the elevator. Pan looked at Herc, and the big guy shrugged. It's too late, and I'm too tired to argue with Seth, he said. I'm going to bed. You make sure he doesn't deal for something unbreakable, all right? Oh, come on, Herc, Pan said, wanting nothing more than to crash down on a soft mattress and bury herself in the warmth of her duvet. I'm good night, Pan, Herc said, flashing her a smile. She looked at Truck, then he shook his head. Bed for me. Good night, kiddo. Buenas noches, Pan, said Knight, before she'd even asked her. Oh, she groaned in frustration, then spun around on her heels, following the old man and the kid. Already she could feel that maddening itch, the call of the engine. She pictured it beneath her, its sprawling insanity, an ocean of moving parts powered by unspeakable evil. And her heart began drumming. The truth was she wasn't tired. The reason she didn't want to babysit Marlowe was because if she went downstairs, if she saw the engine, then the desire to forge a new contract would be almost overwhelming. It always wanted her, and she no longer knew how to say no. Do not dally, Amelia, said Seth from inside the elevator. I do not want to be another 100 years older by the time you join us. She shook her head in resignation and jogged over to them. Marlowe smiled nervously at her, and she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The truth was he didn't know how lucky he was. Right now he was a wheezing, trembling sack of flesh and bone and worry. And in a few minutes, he'd be a god. Okay, let me just do something very quickly. Because if I don't delete the old file, there won't be room for this one. And I always forget to do it. There we go. Okay. So, the engine. Exciting times. Oh, this chapter is called The Engine. Marlowe wasn't sure how it was possible that they could go any deeper. But the elevator rattled downwards at full speed for another minute before it began to slow. He could feel the vast pressure of the earth above him, 1 billion tons of rock and soil bearing down, ready to crush him to jelly. The panic was like a cold fire inside his chest, and he had to fight the urge to scream, to beg for them to take him back to the surface. He tried to take a deep breath to calm himself down, but there was no air here. He panted, fumbling for his inhaler, until the old man put his hand on his arm. "You no longer need it," he said, patting the back of Marlowe's hand like a father taking his son to the first day of school. "It can be a bit much, I know, the moment that everything you thought you knew about the world is proven to be wrong. But it gets better. Come." The elevator shuddered to a halt, and Pan opened the doors. Marlowe focused on her in an attempt to block out everything else. The way she walked, like she owned the place. The way her hips moved. It was almost hypnotic. He kept his eyes on her, so engrossed that it took him a moment to notice there was something in his head. Something scuttling around the circumference of his skull. Something buzzing like a fly. He put his hand to his temple, scratching furiously, but the itch was inside him, unbearable. If he'd had a hammer, he'd have gladly used it to get at whatever crawled and feasted in there. "What is that?" he grunted, using both hands now, feeling like his brain was full of insect eggs, all hatching into needled feet and bulging eyes. Get it out! He felt hands on his, looked to see Pan right in front of him, close enough that he could feel her breath on his lips. Even with his head erupting, he felt himself melt, like the bones had been pulled right out of his legs. "The engine will do its best to mess with you," she said. "You'll feel its touch in your head, in your soul. It's trying to understand you, probe you. It's unlike anything you've ever experienced, and believe me, it will make you feel like you want to die. Ignore it." "Ignore the creepy magic engine that's probing my soul with evil stalker fingers," he said, trying to smile and offering what was probably a grimace. "Okay, cool." Pan studied him for a moment more, and he had the almost overwhelming desire to lean forward and plant his mouth on hers. It would be so easy. She was 6 inches away, and those lips were so full, slightly open. "Do it, and you die," she said, reading his mind. She prodded him hard in the forehead and backed away. "Believe me, the engine is a mean piece of work, but I'm worse." "Do what?" he said, as innocently as he could. "I wasn't sure." They were in a small room, just the elevator on one side and what looked like a vault door on the other. The walls were made of concrete, and the same Nazi decoration covered 2 of them. Somebody had painted over the swastikas, but it was almost as if the poisonous symbol had eroded the paint, causing it to bubble up like diseased skin. "What's with all the Hitler crap?" Marlowe asked. "There's something you're not telling me, because I'm really not into all that white supremacy stuff." Us neither, Marlowe." "Us neither, Marlowe," said Seth, gesturing at himself. "Obviously, no, the Nazis found this place when they invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939. We don't know why exactly, but the engines had been lost for a long time before this, almost forgotten. Fortunately for us, the Nazis did not work out how to use the machine before the end of the war. Things could have turned out very, very differently." "It's why we call it the Pigeon's Nest," Pan said, as she typed a code into a pad by the vault door, like the Führer's mountain hideout that he called the Eagle's Nest. But this place was full of pigeons when the Hellraisers found it. Dead ones. The door bleeped, and she turned to Marlowe. "Nothing I can say, nothing anyone can say, will prepare you for what you're about to see. There's no training you can do, no way of readying yourself. You could have 1,000 years to gear up for your first encounter with the engine, and it would still hit you just as hard. So we're going to throw you right in. The most important thing to remember is that it cannot hurt you. It will mess with your head, it'll make you feel worse than you've ever felt, make you think things that you never thought yourself capable of thinking, make you feel like you're evil, but it cannot hurt you, okay?" "Sure," he said, wanting to add, "No, I'm nowhere near okay. Please just get me out of here. I don't want to be part of this anymore." But the truth was, he was tired of running. "Sure," he said, firmer this time. "I'm ready." Pan breathed out a laugh, like it was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard. Then she smacked a hand down on the pad. Then there was a moment of hesitation before the room was full of noise, a siren blasting out at the same time as a light began to flash above the door. It felt like they were inside a prison, waiting for the gates to release. Why did they need a door this size? Who were they trying to keep out? Or what were they trying to keep in? The hydraulics inside the door hissed. Then there was a clunk as the locks disengaged. It swung open lazily, and Marlowe's last fingerhold on the rock of reality popped loose, plunging him into the abyss. The onslaught was overwhelming. A feast of rotting flesh and howling screams devoured every thought. He gripped his head, blinking away tears, feeling exhausted like he'd been crying for hours. He felt Pan's hand on his arm, and for once her expression had softened. "Come," said Seth, pushing past them both. "We must begin. This is so exciting." Exciting wasn't the word Marlowe would have used, but there was definitely something inside him, past the churning terror, the maddening horror, that made him giddy. Part of him was still convinced that they were all trying to trick him. "They're lying to you," his dreams had told him. But he'd seen it. He'd seen what they could do. You've seen the price they have to pay, too. He closed his eyes, tried to force away the image of the girl, Brianna, being torn to pieces, her soul dragged into the burning ground. It was okay. That wouldn't happen to him. They'd look after him. Right? Pan led the way through the door, and Marlowe kept close behind her, his heart pounding so hard at his ribs that it was as if it was trying to break its way loose just to be closer to her. A strong, cool breeze blew past him, stinking of something that could have been smoke or rotten eggs. He put his hand to his nose and coughed out phlegm in his throat. His inhaler was all but empty now, but he was trying not to think about that. If he had an attack, he was thousands of miles away from his spares, from his nebulizer. Deep breaths, calm and steady. Just don't panic. He stepped through the door and the panic hit him like a punch to the gut. It was like being on a vessel in the dark heart of space. Beyond the door was nothing, just a vast black emptiness that took his breath away, literally snatched it from his lungs. It was impossible to get a sense of how big it was because there were no landmarks. Sorry, kids at home. No landmarks. But somehow he knew it was vast. Something in the immense stillness of the air. He felt as if one more step would send him spinning out into that depthless silence, and he'd be smothered by it, swallowed whole. Gasping, he reached out and grabbed hold of the first thing he could find, a cold metal handrail, clinging on as if his life depended on it. Even like this, rooted in place, he felt as if the entire world might flip upside down at any second, cast him off like somebody shaking a bug from their hand. He screwed his eyes shut, but that only made it worse, made him feel like he was already spinning into oblivion. There was a distant crunch, and he opened his eyes to see a microscopic dot of light in the distance, as tiny as a firefly, seen from the top of a mountain. Another one joined it, then a third, a row of lights flickering towards them, forming a line that could have been a runway. More lights buzzed to life, sparking, and Marlowe's jaw dropped as the size of the space became apparent, bigger even than he'd imagined it, bigger than a dozen football fields, 100 maybe. The hanging lights blinked on, thousands of them, until the cavern was blazing. And what they illuminated was almost enough to make him want to shout for darkness, to pluck out his own eyeballs so as not to see. He stood at the top of a steep, narrow metal staircase that plunged to the cavern floor. Down there was a ledge the size of a classroom, dwarfed by the rest of the chamber. There was nothing there aside from a rectangular pool filled with something that rippled like water, but which gave off no reflection. It was what lay beyond the ledge, though, that was surely impossible. It might have been an ocean, but one made of mechanical parts. It was hard to get a sense of it from up there, but he could make out cogs and levers and gears and springs and spindles, hundreds of thousands of them. No, millions of them. It looked like a dumping ground for old clocks, for clockwork toys and mechanical oddities. The scale of it made him feel like an insect, something minuscule and insignificant, something worthy only of being crushed. And the thought seemed to make the engine grow larger still, made it appear to rise up, to tower over him even though it lay below. It was as if a vast wave was approaching from the other side of the cavern, roaring and blasting and thundering towards him. Then he blinked, and the ocean of parts was once again still, like it hadn't moved in 1,000 years. He suddenly wanted no part of this thing, this vast and ancient device. What had Pan told him? That it had been constructed by the devil? That was impossible, of course. There was no such thing, right? But here now, seeing this abomination sitting fat beneath him, a boundless leviathan of razor-sharp parts, he could easily believe it. It was something that had no right to exist, and he tried to turn, to run back through the door, but he found that he couldn't. "Don't you want to know?" said something in his head, a warm, sour breath, like somebody had clamped their cold lips to his and whispered right into his mouth. He put his hands to his ears, but still the words came. "I can give you anything you want, anything you desire. All you have to do is ask." Another image flooded his battered brain, him running down a track. He couldn't quite figure out why it felt so good until he realised that he wasn't wheezing, wasn't fighting for every breath. It was so vivid that when it dissolved, he almost mourned it, until another one took its place. Pan, her hands on his chest, her lips parted as she moved in for the kiss. All you have to do is ask. All you have to do is ask. Somewhere out in the vast silence of the machine there was an insect's click, a soft, mechanical chirrup. Marlowe's head was suddenly empty again, and his cheeks burning with the sheer power of the fantasy. There was a blissful moment of silence before another one took its place, filling his head like he had a home cinema between his ears. And this one almost made him cry out with joy. He and Danny, his brother, walking up the steps to their house, everything drenched in sunlight as they laughed their way through the front door. His mum hugging him first, then his brother, smelling of dewberry the way she used to, not a single empty bottle in the sink. Danny turned to him, older now, lines on his face, a patch of grey hair by his left ear, but those eyes so full of life, so full of kindness. "All you have to do is ask," his brother said, ruffling his hair. And then Marlowe was dropped back into the cavern, blinking the sun from his eyes like he'd actually been there. The scent of his mum's moisturiser was still in his nose, his scalp tingling from Danny's touch. Pan had reached the bottom of the stairs and she looked up at him curiously. "What's it showing you?" she asked. "Money?" "No," he said, clattering down the steps and standing beside her while Seth shuffled laboriously after them. "No, I saw my brother, Danny. He died." Pan nodded knowingly, looking out into the engine. From down here, Marlowe got a closer look, seeing that it was even more intricate than he'd imagined. It stretched to the left and right for as far as he could see, a shoreline of needles and prongs, each one perfectly still. Huge cables stretched into the engine, and unlike the rest of it, these looked brand new. "Don't," Pan said. "The engine tries to control your choices, tries to make you wish for something impossible. If you deal to bring back the dead..." He thought he saw her shudder, and she ran a hand over her stomach as if to settle it. "I thought the machine could grant any wish," Marlowe said, his voice feeble, like the vast silence out there was pushing it back. "Oh, it can," Pan said. "You can wish your brother back, and he'll be back. But it won't be him. He'll look the part, maybe even speak the part, but he'll be rotten inside. It's a ghost of a memory, wrapped in someone else's dead flesh. We call them worm bags, and they're nasty. Not to mention when you break somebody out of death like that, sooner or later, all hell comes after you to get them back." "And it will cost you everything," Seth shouted down, "because that's one contract we cannot break. The engine knows it too, the damned thing." Marlowe shuddered, but the image of Danny was still etched in his head, as real as anything else in his life. "Remember, the engine isn't your friend," Pan said. "It lies, it deceives. That's its purpose. That's what it's been doing for centuries, tricking people into making a deal, signing a contract." "In return for their soul," Marlowe said. "It can't be real, though. How the hell does it take your soul?" Pan shrugged. "We don't know," she said. "Nobody does. Not even Gramps there." "Yes," said Seth as he reached the ledge. "There are things even I do not know." He stopped, panting for breath. "But Pan is right. You must be very careful what you deal for." "Listen," said Marlowe. "I don't think I should do this. I don't think..." "It'll be fine," said Pan. "Everyone bricks it the first time. You just need to focus. Keep your mind clear." "Yes, know exactly what it is that you want. It is the man who wants everything, and he who does not know what he wants, who lands himself in trouble." Marlowe shook his head, about to give his excuses and leave, but there were suddenly voices from the top of the stairs. A face appeared through the door, the British guy, Hanson, still wearing his sunglasses. Next to him were the two guys from the elevator, Hope and Bullwinkle. "Looks like Herc's jerks have beaten us to it," said Hanson, galloping down the stairs. "Past your bedtime, isn't it, Amelia?" "Oh, screw you," Pan said. He just laughed. "One day, maybe I'll let you," he said, turning to Marlowe. In the harsh light of the cabin, he looked older than he had before, lines etched into his face. But without seeing his eyes, it was impossible to know for sure. "Gonna throw the new dog in the pool? See if it drowns?" Call someone a dog too many times, Marlowe said, speaking slowly so he wouldn't trip over his tongue, and they might just start to bite. Hansen considered this for a moment, then leaned forward. The lenses of his shades were mirrored, and Marlowe could see his own face there, greasy and drawn, about as intimidating as a wet blanket. For a second he thought he could almost see Hansen's eyes too, but he must have been mistaken because they looked like two empty pits in his head. Then, said Hansen softly, they get put to sleep. What do you want, Hansen? Pan asked with obvious disgust. If you're here to make a contract, then just piss off. No, he replied. I think I'll stay. It could be fun. Nothing better than watching a new fish cock up his first contract, said Bullwinkle. That look in their eyes when they realise they've made an unbreakable deal, said Hope. Marlowe felt sick, felt the asthma start to fill his lungs with gunk the way it always did when he was angry. He coughed, trying not to make it too obvious. Just ignore them, Pan said, walking to the edge of the pool. They're not worth it. Marlowe glared at Hansen for a fraction of a second before turning away. He walked swiftly over to Pan, speaking low. Maybe they're right. I have no idea what I'm doing. He looked at the pool of water, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was filled with a liquid that didn't look real. It was as black as tar, and yet ripples danced lightly across its surface, like there was something in there. Even though there were lights hanging right above it, there was no sign of their glow in the pool. And when Marlowe leaned over, he saw no reflection there. Small, silver flecks floated in it, like stars. A nod to all you Furnace readers there. The movement of the liquid was mesmerising, sickeningly so, reminding him of liquid mercury. Seth was busying himself with a control panel on the other side of the pool, something that looked like it belonged inside NASA. Seriously, Pan, Marlowe whispered. Can't we do this another time? Like tomorrow? His voice must have carried, because somebody behind him made a clucking chicken sound. He blew a wheezing breath out of his mouth, wanting to reach for his inhaler, but refusing to look weak. He wasn't even sure if there was anything left in it. Pan looked at him, raising an eyebrow. You going to let these guys get to you, she asked. It's your choice, Marlowe. I'm not going to force you. Just remember that most people would give anything to be here right now, to have this chance. What are you going to wish for? Seth interrupted. To be able to breathe without impediment? I would recommend it. We know how to deal with that contract. We had a young woman with terrible asthma many years ago. Had. And something else, perhaps. It seems a bit of a waste to limit yourself to that. Pan, any suggestions? How about making him smell less disgusting, said Hope. Give him strength and speed, said Pan. Start with the basics. Have some fun. Good, good, said Seth. Marlowe felt like he was on a train that was out of control, moving way too fast. He tried to force the brakes on again. Look, I'm really grateful for this, but I'm not feeling so good. Please, can we just do this tomorrow? Repeat what you're going to wish for, Seth said, like Marlowe's voice wasn't working. I don't know what you mean, he said, clawing in a breath. It did little to stem the panic, and this time he did reach for his inhaler, firing off a shot that was full of nothing. He shook it and tried again, breathing hard, swearing. Just say it, said Pan, so it's clear. Breathing, Marlowe said. I want to be able to breathe normally. He thought he heard his words echoing across the cavern, but then understood he was hearing something else, the soft, knitting needle whir of some part of the machine. There were other noises inside his head too soft to identify, fleshy and wet. They made his skin crawl. There was an explosion of light in the core of his brain, like a firework going off. I want to be as strong as 10 men, said Pan. I want to run faster than sound. Seriously, I can't, Marlowe said. The clicks from the engine were growing louder, the sound of something huge coming slowly to life. Say it, she said. I want to be able to breathe normally. I want to be as strong as 10 men. I want to run faster than sound. Again, she said, louder. He repeated the words, then again, until Pan turned to Seth and shrugged. The old man beamed at Marlowe. You are ready, he said. You can enter the pool. I can what? Said Marlowe, shaking his head. No way, man. I am not going in there. The liquid rippled and danced, its mottled surface impenetrable, the colour of disease. He had no idea how deep the pool was, what else might be in there. It had been so long since he'd last been swimming that he wasn't even sure if he could remember how to stay afloat. No way, he said again. I can't do this, Pam. I won't. I just need time, okay? Just what I thought, said Hansen. They all try to be hard. They all fall to pieces. Pathetic. This has got nothing to do with you, said Marlowe, jabbing a finger at the English guy. You don't know me. I know everything about you, he sneered. I've seen your kind before, full of bravado, bollocks the size of beach balls, right up until the point it hits the fan. Then you go crying back to mummy with your tail between your legs. It was just like being back at school. Caputo telling him he was out of control, waiting to self-destruct. Oh, screw them. They had no right to tell him what to do. Why don't you go... He only managed to get those 4 words out before Hansen flicked a finger and Hope broke into a run. She was fast, grabbing one of Marlowe's arms with impossible strength. Marlowe reached for her with his free hand, but it wouldn't move, as if he was bound with invisible ropes, just like back in the elevator. Bullwinkle was stepping forward, and each time his fingers twitched, the bones in Marlowe's arms seemed to creak. The pain burned through him, and he gritted his teeth against it. Hansen, yelled Pan, don't! He ignored her, walking up to Marlowe and clamping a gloved hand around his jaw. Marlowe kicked out, but Hansen just smacked his leg away with an iron blow. He tried to breathe, but his lungs had all but given up, refusing to let the air in. His whole body was a fury of panic, sparks of light bristling across his vision. Hansen, Pan said. Seth, for God's sake, stop them. You're all the same, Herc's dogs, Hansen said. I've seen it so many times. He pushed forward, the 3 of them just about lifting Marlowe off the floor. He tried to look over his shoulder, knowing how close they were to the pool, but Hansen held him tight. How many like you have we seen come and go? Hansen whispered, pulling Marlowe close. Once again he could see his reflection in those glasses, the face of a hanged man gasping his last breath. It will eat you alive, spit you out. But so what? Let it have you. No, Marlowe said. But it was too late. Hope and Bullwinkle let him go, and Hansen's fist connected with his stomach, a punch that seemed to turn him inside out. He staggered back, spluttering, putting his foot down on thin air. Then he was falling, only the dancing pool of dead water there to catch him. Oh, poor Marlowe, he's not having a good day. We'll read one more and find out what happens. Inside the engine. It was like falling into death. The pool stank of open graves, of maggot-infested flesh, worming down his gullet, choking him, pulling him in. He burst out again, grappling for something solid, his legs thrashing into nothing. He found the lip of the pool, clutched at it. Not today, said Hansen, grinding a foot down onto his knuckles. He let go, barely able to keep his head above water. Pan, help, he said, coughing, wheezing, kicking. It's too late, Pan said. Whatever you do, don't forget what to deal for. Marlowe tried to reach for her, but the pool held him like it had fingers. He felt something glide past his foot, an icy grip around his ankle, and he screamed. The darkness took advantage, sliding into his mouth. Something latched onto his arm, like there was an army of corpses beneath the surface, and he fought against it, floundering. Do not struggle, said Seth. It cannot hurt you. Oh, it hurts you, Hansen said, 1 foot on the edge. It's a nightmare in there. Did they tell you that some people never even make it out of the pool? What? Oh, you're such an asshole, Hansen, Pan yelled. Marlowe, ignore everything the engine shows you. They're lies. It will try to trick you. Whatever was holding him began to pull, tugging hard on his skin as he thrashed on the surface of the pool. He was hyperventilating, his lungs exploding as he tried to take a breath, but nothing was happening. He felt his body begin to slide into unconsciousness, his eyes rolling back in their sockets. The fluid was leaking into them, blades of black light carving up his vision. Through them, he saw Hansen grinning. This couldn't be the last sight he would ever see. It couldn't be. Shut it out, Pan said. Keep your wishes in your head. Don't forget. Never forget. And whatever you do, Hansen said, leaning towards him, his words muted by the liquid that burrowed into his ears. Don't think about Pan with no clothes on. The invisible fingers reeled him under, the whole world turning black. He struggled, feeling himself dragged deeper and deeper, faster and faster, the fluid boiling past his head, his stomach in knots. He felt like he was being sucked into a vortex, something that would pull him to the very centre of the earth. Or even deeper than that, something that will drag you to the very depths of hell. He opened his mouth and water flooded into his lungs, cold and choking, but somehow letting him breathe. A face appeared in the darkness. Danny, a smile blazing out beneath his combat helmet. It was the Danny he knew from the photograph, exactly the same. Sunglasses, the armoured car, the tents in the background. He died 8 days after the photograph was taken. "But I don't have to," he said. "Marlowe, please save me. Let me come home." Couldn't he do it? Couldn't he do this one good thing? Bring him back? It's so easy. It's just a wish. Just think it. "I want to see Mum again, Marley. Take me to her." Marlowe nodded. Then he shook his head. There was something wrong with his brother's smile. It was too wide, his teeth like broken glass. "You're not him," Marlowe said. "You're not Danny." His brother's smile twisted into an expression of horror, his mouth opening too wide. His face began to peel away like old wallpaper, maggots and mealworms squirming out from beneath his flapping skin. Then he was gone, and Charlie was there, or at least a fly-blown mass of jellied meat that might once have been him. "You left me to die," he said, one of his lips peeling loose, rolling wetly down the front of his shirt. "You left me to fall in the river and drown." "Wish me okay, Marlowe," said Charlie. "That's what friends do for each other. All it takes is a wish." "I'm sorry," Marlowe said, and he almost gave in, almost wished for him to be safe back on Staten Island. Then Pam's words blazed back into his mind. "Ignore everything it shows you. They're lies. It will try to trick you." He reached into his memory. Everything so far away, nothing real. But there were words there. "I want to be able to breathe normally. I want to be as strong as 10 men. I want to run faster than sound." It was stupid, ludicrous, like a kid before Christmas. But he kept saying them over and over, a mantra that held the engine at bay. There was another thought in his head, planted there by Hansen. Pan, looking at him and smiling, reaching out and touching his face. She wasn't wearing a scrap of clothing, and the sight of her was almost enough for him to forget where he was. "No," he said, repeating his wishes again and again, forcing the words from his lips. Somewhere, it seemed like miles away, but how could it be? The pool was only small. The darkness seemed to be parting, great black clouds billowing to the side. A crack of thunder pulsed through the water, felt rather than heard, like the skull-crushing blast of a depth charge. There was something there beyond the shadows. It was a figure, one that was surely far too big to fit here, one that might have been as vast as a mountain. Marlowe turned away. He didn't want to look, but the invisible hands gripped his head, forcing him to see. There was something wrong with the figure, like it was radiating darkness, waves of invisible black light that broke against Marlowe's skull. It was a monstrous bag of bones and skin, peering down at him with a clutch of eyes as watery as egg whites. It seemed to radiate cruelty.
"This is what you desire."
There were no words in his head, but he understood what was being asked of him. He didn't want this anymore, didn't want anything to do with this thing, but he knew it was too late. Some people never make it out of the pool. Those who changed their minds, those who didn't wish for anything. He didn't know. He didn't want to know. He just wanted out, away from this nightmare and the corpse hands that held him. "I want to be able to breathe normally," he was almost screeching. "I want to be as strong as 10 men. I want to run faster than sound. And Pan, I want her to love me," his brain added without his permission.
"It is done,"
said the wordless voice in his head.
"It is yours, and the price is your soul."
And with that thought came an unbearable sadness, a huge, gaping, lonely absence that made him feel as if everybody he'd ever loved had died. He howled in despair, clutching at his stomach, trying to hold himself in. He realised that his arms were free and he began to paddle upwards, desperately pushing himself towards the surface. His lungs were 2 shriveled sacks inside his chest, empty of everything but pain. He kicked and struggled his way through the liquid, suddenly bursting through the top of the pool into a riot of colour and noise. Hands reached for him, dragging him out, and he clung onto them with everything he had. There was a cry of pain, then he was dropped onto the stone floor. "Let go, Marlowe, let go, easy now, easy." Marlowe released his grip, the world swimming into focus. Seth was there, his face contorted with pain. Pan was next to him, one hand on the old man. Marlowe coughed, spitting the last dregs of black water from his mouth. They landed on the floor, wriggling like worms, squirming their way back towards the pool as if they were living things. The sight of them, hundreds of droplets swarming over each other, made Marlowe gag. He retched until his stomach was empty. He tried to push himself up, but the whole world was swimming. "Wait there," said Pan. "Marlowe, don't move. Give us a second." She looked flushed, the colour on her cheeks making her even more beautiful than before. Marlowe lay there on the stone, tasting the acid in his mouth. Hansen and his two douches stood exactly where they had before, those crap-eating grins still plastered over their faces. Marlowe turned back to Seth and Pan. The old man was shaking his wrist, still grimacing. "That is some grip you have there, Marlowe," he said. "What?" Marlowe asked, looking at his hand. Nothing had changed. He didn't feel any different. Wait. He sucked in a breath, and he could have been standing at the top of a mountain, his lungs full of crisp, clean, oxygenated air. He breathed out slowly, not wanting to jinx it. Then tried again. It was like it was the first time he'd ever truly taken a breath, and he almost laughed with the joy of it. "I can breathe," he said, grinning. "Holy crap, I can breathe." "You can probably wrestle a bear too," said Seth, and Marlowe understood what must have happened. Seth offering him a hand out of the pool, Marlowe grabbing his arm, squeezing hard. He flexed his fingers. It was impossible, right? How could he have the strength of 10 men? "No way," he said, looking at Pan. She was redder than ever, like she was flustered. She stared back at him, biting her bottom lip. She looked different, softer somehow, like her icy exterior had started to melt. Marlowe had to turn away, his own cheeks flaring. If he wasn't careful, then he was going to have to throw himself back in the pool. "How long was I in there?" he asked, pushing himself to his feet. "A second. Less, really," said Seth. "You went under, then you came up instantly. There is no time inside the engine. My guess is it felt quite a bit longer to you." "A second," said Marlowe. "But he'd been down there for minutes. It can't be." "How did you do, doggy?" Hansen said. "What did you wish for?" "Go on. Tell us you brought the dead back," said Bullwinkle. "Time travel. Something unbreakable. Make our day. We love seeing the demons eat rookies for breakfast." "You guys make me sick," said Pam. "Poor little princess," said Hansen, pouting. Marlowe stepped forward, feeling like a new person, feeling like somebody had injected him with adrenaline, stripped out everything that made him weak. "Why don't you do as she says and piss off?" he said, his heart drumming like it had an engine of his own. He felt like a machine, like it could do just about anything. Hansen raised his hands in mock surrender. "Don't worry, I'm going. This bores me. I'll leave you two together. Let the puppy have his bitch." Last straw. Marlowe threw himself at Hansen, feeling the world suddenly slow, like it had run out of momentum. It was as if everybody else had frozen. Only he was moving. Sprinting across the stone, his fist balling up. He unleashed a punch, aimed right at Hansen's nose. Only then did time suddenly catch up with itself, snapping back with a sudden lurch. Marlowe's fist connected with Hansen like two cars colliding, the impact so powerful that a shockwave blasted out across the chamber, kicking the surface of the pool into a frenzy. Hansen collapsed onto one knee with the force of it, his glasses splintering into shrapnel and exploding across the stone. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Pan said, running to Marlowe and grabbing his arm. "Christ, that's enough." Marlowe looked down at his fist, suddenly afraid of what he was capable of. Hansen shook his head, picking glass from his face, then slowly stood. What Marlowe saw there made him stagger back. He had no eyes. They were completely gone, leaving two red, ragged holes in his face. Somehow, though, they still seemed to burn into Marlowe like blowtorches. Hansen straightened his collar and then smiled, the skin around his nose already starting to bruise. "Hansen, he's new. He didn't know what he was doing," Pan said, manoeuvring herself in front of Marlowe like a shield. There was a tremor in her voice that was even more unsettling than Hansen's eyeless death stare. "You were being an ass. Let's just call it even, okay?" "Like I said," Hansen replied, running a long pink tongue around his lips, then spitting blood. He blinked, his eyelids flapping wetly, uselessly over the gaping pits in his face. "You two deserve each other. But try that again, dog. I'll skin you alive." He studied Marlowe a moment more, a fly scuttling out of one of his eye sockets, buzzing up into the dark. Then he turned and walked up the stairs, his two lieutenants sloping after him. Pan waited until they disappeared through the door before she turned to Marlowe, letting out a long, ragged breath. Oh, God. "I thought he was going to kill you," she said. "I could have..." "No, you couldn't," she said. "Not him. Not even if he wasn't under contract. Jesus, Marlowe. If you'd hit a normal person like that, you could have sent their head spinning out into the middle of the engine." He looked at his hands, swallowing uncomfortably. You're not you anymore, Pan said, fanning her face with her hand like she'd just run a marathon. You've got to remember that. Hug someone too hard and they'll burst. High-five somebody and you'll snap their wrist. She swore. Man, maybe we should have thought this through. But I don't feel any different. You are, said Pan, staring into the mechanical ocean. It had once again fallen silent and still, its work done. You've got that inside you. The thought made him feel sick, made him itch like he no longer had veins but pipes, not bones but levers and springs. He closed his eyes, took a few deep breaths, the air sliding into his lungs crystal clear. When he opened them again, he was surprised to see Pan standing right in front of him, squirming like she was uncomfortable, so close that he could feel her breath on his face. His heart flipped in his chest, so carried away that it took a few seconds to settle back into a rhythm. What? Was all he had time to say before Pan leaned in and planted her lips on his, kissing him. She opened her mouth and he felt her tongue dart into his, exploring. He stood there, no idea how to respond, his brain screaming, "Oh my God, kiss her back, you idiot!" And he did, his hands gently resting on her elbows, the lightest of touches, like she was a bird he didn't want to startle. He wasn't sure how long it went on for. There was no time here either. The moment so unexpected, so incredible that it seemed to have lifted them out of the world into their own ageless, private universe. Eventually, Pan broke free, stepping back, her mouth still open, her tongue running across her own lips. She stared at Marlowe like he was the most desirable thing in the world, her pupils so dilated that she didn't look real. Then her face crumpled into a look of fury. She swung her fist and punched Marlowe in the mouth, hard enough to rock his head back. He staggered away, yelping. "You bastard," she said. "You wished for it, didn't you? You wished for me." "No," he said, retreating as she advanced. "I didn't. It wasn't my fault. It was Hansen. He planted the idea in my head. Please, I would never." She threw herself at him again, and he did his best to shield his face, only to feel her lips on his, her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. He couldn't resist, his brain struggling to make sense of what was going on. He kissed her back, and then it felt as if an atomic bomb had been detonated in his stomach. He dropped, nursing his groin where Pan had kneed him. It felt like he was on fire down there, and he groaned, everything turning into a blur through his watering eyes. "Enjoy your gifts while you can," said Pan, "but that's one wish that even the engine can't grant. Seth, cancel that contract right now. And you," she loomed over him, a finger jabbing repeatedly into his forehead, "you better not tell a goddamned soul about this." Then she was gone, leaving him with the powers of a Superman, but crying like a baby. Right, we'll leave it there, and the next few chapters we will see what Marlowe does with his powers. And there's another big action scene coming up. Okay, thank you very much for joining me. Yeah, I hope you're all well and enjoying this book. I do really like this book. I have a very soft spot. I never did as well as Furnace, but I just really enjoy the idea of superpowers and the devil and all these things. I think it's really cool. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying it. I'll see you in the next couple of days probably for a bit more. Okay, have a nice evening, whatever you're up to. Bye.